Jake's head throbbed as he regained consciousness, his body slumped against a cold metal wall. His eyes flickered open to a dimly lit cell, the air thick with an unfamiliar metallic scent. His last memory was a late-night run to the convenience store. Then nothing. No struggle, no warning. Just a sharp flash of light and darkness. Now he was here, wherever here was. He pushed himself upright, scanning his surroundings. The walls pulsed faintly with a bluish hue, not like any material he had ever seen. He wasn't alone. In the adjacent cells, towering figures shifted in the shadows. Some had iridescent scales, others had thick, chitinous armor. None of them looked human. They weren't looking at him directly, but he could feel their nervous glances. Something about him unsettled them, but he had no idea why. A deep, mechanical hum reverberated through the floor. Without warning, his cell door slid open. He barely had time to react before two massive guards, their skin a dull gray and their arms bulging with unnatural strength, seized him. He fought instinctively, throwing a sharp elbow into one of their sides, but it barely fazed the creature. One of them jabbed a rod into his ribs, sending a sharp jolt through his body. His limbs locked up, and his vision blurred as they dragged him down a corridor bathed in eerie green light. The hallway opened up into something massive, an arena, filled with thousands of roaring spectators. Jake blinked against the blinding spotlights as he was thrown onto the coarse ground. His fingers dug into the dust, its texture like crushed stone mixed with something organic. The air carried the scent of sweat, blood, and something unfamiliar, something ancient. He pushed himself to his feet, shaking off the lingering effects of the shock. Towering above him, encircling the arena, were hundreds of aliens, each one more bizarre than the last. Some had elongated snouts filled with rows of serrated teeth, others had glowing eyes embedded deep into thick skulls. The crowd jeered and laughed, their voices mixing into a chaotic roar. A booming voice echoed across the arena. "A new contender! A creature of unknown origin, untested and proven!" The laughter from the stands intensified. To them, he was entertainment, nothing more. A gate on the far side of the arena rumbled open. From the shadows emerged a warrior unlike anything Jake had seen. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in segmented, obsidian-like armor. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and in its hands, it wielded a weapon that crackled with dark energy. The way it moved, calculated, deliberate, told Jake that it had fought in this arena many times before. Jake's heart pounded. He wasn't a stranger to combat, but this wasn't a back-alley fight or a battlefield skirmish. This was a spectacle. A fight meant to end with one person dead, and the crowd was eager to see it happen. He clenched his fists, shifting into a ready stance. He had no weapon, no armor, just his instincts and training. He scanned the creature for weaknesses, but before he could form a plan, he noticed something odd. The roaring laughter in the arena was fading. The energy in the air had shifted, not into excitement, but uncertainty. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. It wasn't the way he stood, or the lack of fear in his stance. It was something else. His gaze followed theirs, downward, until it landed on his left forearm. His old tattoo, faded but clear, a symbol from his military days, a simple insignia marking his unit. And yet, the aliens were staring at it like it was something far more than that. The announcer, who moments ago had been bellowing with confidence, stuttered to a halt. The warrior, who had stepped forward with assured dominance, hesitated. Jake didn't understand what was happening, but he wasn't about to waste an opportunity. He straightened, lifting his arms slightly, exposing the tattoo fully. The effect was immediate. The crowd, once hungry for blood, now murmured in uneasy whispers. The warrior took a step back. Even the guards lining the arena tensed, their hands inching toward their weapons. Jake smirked slightly, masking his confusion behind a show of confidence. He didn't know why his tattoo was causing such a reaction, but he wasn't about to question it, not yet. Whatever they thought it meant, it was enough to make an entire Colosseum second-guess themselves. And that was an advantage he could use. The energy in the arena had changed entirely. Just moments ago, The aliens had been ready to see him torn apart, but now, a thick silence clung to the air. The once jeering spectators exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern. The massive warrior who had looked eager to rip Jake apart now hesitated, his glowing eyes darting between the tattoo on Jake's arm and the high-ranking officials in the stands. Jake stayed still, his mind racing. What was it about this tattoo that had made an entire alien audience rethink their bloodlust? He had gotten it years ago, just a standard mark of his military unit. It wasn't anything special, at least not on Earth. But here? Here, it was something else entirely. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Some of the aliens looked afraid, their eyes wide with disbelief. Others were muttering urgently to each other, pointing toward him with tense gestures. He caught snippets of their hushed voices, words in an unfamiliar language that, strangely, felt weighted with meaning. And then, for the first time since he was thrown into this nightmare, someone spoke to him in a way he could understand. An alien elder, draped in ceremonial robes that shimmered with a silver glow, stepped forward from an enclosed section of the stands. His voice was deep and weathered, layered with something that felt like centuries of authority. "That mark," the elder said, his eyes locked onto Jake's tattoo. "It cannot be." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You mind explaining why?" The elder didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the other officials seated behind him, exchanging glances that were a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Finally, he faced Jake again, his expression unreadable. "There is a legend," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "One that speaks of a race of warriors who once conquered the stars with fire and steel. A species so ruthless and powerful that entire civilizations were wiped from existence before they could even react. They were said to be unmatched in battle, relentless in their conquest. Eventually, the galaxy united against them, and through great sacrifice, they were defeated, or so we believed." Jake frowned. "You're saying my people did that?" The elder hesitated. "Not just your people. Your kind was erased from our history. Records were burned, databases purged. It was forbidden to even speak of them, in the hope that they would never return. But some knowledge survived, passed down through whispers and warnings." His eyes darkened. "And among those remnants is a symbol. A mark of their most fearsome warriors." Jake didn't have to look to know what he was talking about. His damn tattoo. The elder took a step closer, studying Jake with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "If you are truly one of them," he said carefully, "then we have made a grave mistake bringing you here." The tension in the arena was suffocating. The aliens weren't just worried. They were terrified. The officials whispered urgently among themselves, and the warriors who had been prepared to fight Jake only minutes ago now refused to meet his gaze. Jake wasn't sure what to do with this information. He had no idea whether this legend had any truth to it, but he wasn't about to correct them. If they thought he was some long-lost nightmare from the past, that was fine by him. The announcer, who had been struck silent during this revelation, suddenly cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "The trial is postponed," he declared, though it sounded more like a plea. "The council must deliberate." Jake suppressed a smirk. That was one way to avoid a fight. Two guards hesitantly approached him, no longer dragging him but instead guiding him toward an exit with wary movements, as if afraid he might lash out at any moment. The crowd remained frozen, unsure whether they had just witnessed the return of a legend or something far worse. As Jake was escorted through a massive archway, he stole one last glance over his shoulder at the thousands of alien faces staring at him with a mixture of fear and awe. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. He wasn't a prisoner anymore. The moment he was out of sight of the crowd, the energy of the guards changed. They no longer handled him roughly, no longer treated him like a disposable combatant. Instead, they guided him through winding halls with an uneasy reverence, as if they weren't quite sure what he was or what he was capable of. Jake played along, keeping his posture relaxed but alert. He didn't know where they were taking him, but he had a feeling it wasn't back to a cell. Eventually, they entered a vast chamber adorned with intricate carvings and floating holographic displays. Several high-ranking officials stood in the center, deep in conversation. The moment they saw him, they fell silent. The elder from before stood at the head of the gathering. "We must speak," he said, his tone carrying a weight that Jake couldn't ignore. Jake folded his arms, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm listening." The elder gestured to a nearby chair, less a throne, more a seat of importance. It was a clear sign of status, a shift from how he had been treated just an hour ago. "You must understand," the elder continued, "that your presence here changes everything. We thought your kind was extinct, that you had been wiped from existence. But if you are here, then either we were mistaken, or your people have returned in secret." Jake leaned forward slightly. "And that scares you?" The elder's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes." There was no use denying it. The way they looked at him, this was more than a historic curiosity. They feared him. They feared what he represented. One of the officials, a sleek-skinned alien with piercing violet eyes, finally spoke. "We must know the truth. Are you alone?" Jake considered his answer carefully. They clearly thought he was part of some larger force, some forgotten nightmare lurking beyond the stars. Maybe it was better to let them keep thinking that. "For now," he said vaguely. The room stiffened at the implication. It was the right move. Now they were too afraid to kill him outright. The elder exhaled slowly, nodding as if coming to a decision. "Then we will not risk angering the unknown," he said, voice carefully measured. "You are no longer a prisoner. You are a guest." Jake let that sink in. A guest. They weren't just letting him live, they were elevating his status. "Good," he said simply. For the first time since he had woken up in that cell, he felt a shift in control. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was playing the game. And he intended to win. Jake sat in a chamber far removed from the bloodthirsty roars of the arena, surrounded by alien officials who had moments ago been ready to watch him die. Now, they treated him with measured caution, their fear hidden behind carefully controlled expressions. The shift in their demeanor was almost amusing. These beings, who had built an empire strong enough to host brutal gladiator games, now handled him like he was a live grenade with the pin barely in place. A long, polished table stretched before him, covered in exotic-looking fruit, roasted meats of questionable origin, and gleaming crystal goblets filled with luminescent liquids. It was a feast fit for royalty, and yet Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was less about hospitality and more about keeping him comfortable until they figured out what to do with him. The elder, the same one who had spoken of the ancient warrior legend, sat across from him. His silver robes shimmered in the dim lighting, his long, reptilian fingers tapping idly against the table. "It is our deepest regret that we misjudged you," he said, voice smooth and diplomatic. "Had we known your true nature, you would never have been subjected to the indignity of the arena." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Right. Because treating me like a guest was the plan all along." The elder didn't react to the sarcasm. "We wish to avoid unnecessary conflict," he continued. "If you truly are what we suspect, then you must understand that our concern is for the stability of the galaxy." Jake leaned back in his chair, pretending to consider his words. He had no idea what they truly believed about him, but one thing was clear: they were scared. And scared people made mistakes. "So what happens now?" he asked, plucking a small, purple fruit from a golden dish and inspecting it. "You roll out the red carpet? Give me a tour of your planet?" The elder's lips pressed into a thin line. "We wish to establish an understanding," he said carefully. "Perhaps even an alliance." Jake stilled for a moment, his fingers tightening around the fruit. They were trying to rope him into something, trying to control whatever threat they thought he represented. He had seen tactics like this before, diplomacy laced with quiet manipulation. "I appreciate the offer," he said, setting the fruit down without taking a bite. "But I have no intention of sticking around long enough to play politics." The elder tilted his head. "Leaving may not be so simple. You arrived as a captive. If word spreads of what you are, there will be those who seek to challenge you. Or worse." Jake smirked. Funny, that almost sounds like a threat. A precaution, the elder corrected. If you wish to survive here, you must prove yourself worthy of the power you represent. There it was. The hook. They wanted him to jump through their hoops, to play into whatever myth they had built around his tattoo. What exactly does proving myself look like? Jake asked. A pause. Then the elder gestured to one of the guards, who stepped forward and activated a holographic display. A projection flickered to life, showing an open courtyard, where alien warriors trained in brutal, coordinated combat. A demonstration of your skill, the elder said. Non-lethal, of course. A simple match against some of our finest. If you are truly a descendant of the warriors from our legends, it should be illuminating. Jake exhaled slowly, hiding his frustration. They wanted a show, something to confirm their suspicions. If he refused, it would only make them question him more. If he agreed, he risked giving away too much, but it could also buy him time. Fine, he said. Let's see what your best fighters have to offer. Hours later, Jake stood in a circular training ground, surrounded by an audience of high-ranking officials and warriors. The setting was different from the arena, more structured, more controlled. The air crackled with tension as his opponents entered the ring, 3 towering fighters, each wielding an energy-infused staff. Their movements were calculated, disciplined. These weren't mindless brutes, they were trained soldiers. Jake rolled his shoulders. He had fought skilled opponents before, but never aliens armed with weapons that buzzed like electrified hornets. The first warrior lunged, swinging his staff in a blur. Jake dodged, barely avoiding the crackling energy at its tip. The second struck from behind, forcing him to twist out of the way. The third was faster, closing the gap and aiming for his ribs. Jake reacted on instinct. He ducked low, grabbed the third warrior's wrist, and twisted. The alien let out a guttural sound as Jake used his own momentum to flip him onto the ground. The crowd murmured in surprise. The other 2 warriors adjusted their stances, more cautious now. They came at him together, their staffs striking in perfect synchronization. Jake evaded one and deflected the other with a well-timed kick, using their overcommitment against them. He wasn't stronger than them, not by a long shot, but he was unpredictable. And that made all the difference. Minutes later, all 3 warriors were sprawled on the ground, disarmed and panting. Jake stood over them, barely winded. He glanced toward the elder, who observed with an unreadable expression. I think that proves my point, Jake said. The elder nodded slowly. Indeed. Later, as Jake was escorted back to his quarters, he let himself smile for the first time since this whole mess started. He had played their game and won. Now, it was time to start playing his own. As he settled onto the lavish bed they had provided, he began mentally mapping out his next steps. The more access they gave him, the more opportunities he had to escape. He had already noticed weaknesses, unguarded corridors, blind spots and security rotations, key figures who could be manipulated. He needed resources. A ship. A way to communicate with Earth, if Earth even had the capability to hear him. Most importantly, he needed allies. There had to be others like him, other prisoners, other fighters, who wanted out just as badly. But before he could act, he had to be careful. He had seen the way the officials whispered among themselves when they thought he wasn't listening. He could feel the weight of their paranoia. They didn't trust him, not fully. And that meant, sooner or later, they would try to get rid of him. He wasn't going to let them. Jake lay awake in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, every nerve on high alert. The alien council might have called him a guest, but he knew better. Fear wasn't the same as loyalty. It wasn't even respect. It was only a delay before the inevitable. The way the officials spoke, the way the guards moved, the way the whispers followed him whenever he left a room, it was obvious. They weren't planning to let him go. He needed to act first. The plan began forming in his head, piecing itself together from small details he had observed over the past few days. The guard shifts were irregular but predictable. There were gaps in the patrol patterns near the lower levels of the compound. The security doors were biometric, but he had already seen officials using override codes. Most importantly, the spaceport was located just beyond the central structure, heavily guarded but accessible, if he had the right distraction. But before he could set anything in motion, something unexpected happened. A voice, hushed and urgent, came from the shadows near his door. "Human!" Jake tensed but didn't move. He had been expecting something like this. Slowly, he turned his head toward the source. A figure stepped forward, tall, armored, but not a guard. It was one of the prisoners from the lower cells, an alien with deep blue skin and 4 narrow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. "You don't belong here," the alien whispered. "And neither do I." Jake sat up, watching him carefully. "You have a name?" "Kieran," the alien said. "And I think we can help each other." Jake exhaled slowly. This was good. He needed an inside man, someone who knew the compound better than he did. Someone who had their own reason to run. "All right, Kieran," he said. "Tell me what you know." Within minutes, the pieces of the escape fell into place. Kieran had been held captive for years, forced to fight in the arena, much like Jake had been. But unlike Jake, he wasn't a last-minute addition. He had seen the ins and outs of the system. He knew which doors led where, which guards could be bribed, which weapons were stored in which armory. But there was a problem. "They're planning to kill you," Kieran said bluntly. Jake had expected as much. "When?" "Soon," Kieran said. "The Council isn't sure what you are. But they don't like not knowing." Jake smirked. "That's their mistake." The plan had to happen that night. Jake and Kieran moved fast, using the gaps in the patrol routes to make their way through the lower halls. Every step was a calculated risk. They avoided detection by sheer luck and quick thinking, ducking into alcoves and moving just as the guards turned away. The armory was the first stop. Rows of energy weapons lined the walls, each one more advanced than anything Jake had ever seen. He grabbed a compact pulse rifle and an assortment of small explosives, tucking them into a makeshift belt. Kieran did the same, arming himself with a blade that vibrated at an almost imperceptible frequency. Then came the hard part, getting to the spaceport. The moment they stepped into the open corridor leading to the hangar bay, the alarms blared. Jake swore under his breath. "Guess they noticed," Kieran growled, flicking his blade open. "We fight our way out." Jake nodded. No more sneaking. No more hiding. Guards poured into the corridor, their weapons raised. Jake didn't wait. He dropped to one knee and fired the pulse rifle, sending a shockwave of energy down the hall. The first wave of guards went down instantly, but more followed. Kieran moved like a blur, his blade slicing through armor as he fought alongside Jake. They pressed forward, taking down anything that stood in their way. By the time they reached the hangar bay, the air was thick with smoke and sparks. Ships of all sizes were docked along the massive platform, but only one mattered, a sleek, one-man craft that looked fast enough to outrun anything chasing them. "Go!" Kieran shouted, covering Jake as he sprinted toward the ship. Jake vaulted into the cockpit, his fingers flying over unfamiliar controls. The engines roared to life. "Get in!" he yelled at Kieran. But Kieran hesitated. He glanced back toward the corridor, where more guards were flooding in. "I have unfinished business," Kieran said, stepping away from the ship. Jake clenched his jaw. He didn't have time to argue. "Stay alive," he said. Kieran gave him a nod before vanishing into the chaos. Jake pulled the throttle. The ship lifted off the platform, thrusters burning hot as he angled toward the sky. The hangar doors were closing fast, but he pushed the ship forward, banking hard as he shot through the narrowing gap. The moment he hit open space, the warning lights on the console blared. "Enemy fighters." "Of course," Jake muttered, gripping the controls tighter. They weren't going to let him go without a fight. Lasers streaked past as he dodged and weaved, his instincts taking over. The ship's weapons systems lit up on the display, and he wasted no time, locking onto the nearest pursuer and firing. The enemy ship exploded in a brilliant flash, but more followed. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them forever. He needed an escape route, fast. Then, just as the enemy ships closed in, his console beeped with an incoming signal. A set of coordinates. Jake frowned. Who the hell was helping him? There was no time to question it. He punched in the coordinates, and hit the jump drive. The stars around him stretched into infinity, and just like that, he was gone. The ship jolted violently as it exited hyperspace, the sudden shift making Jake grip the controls tighter. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the surrounding space, half expecting to see enemy ships still on his tail. But there was nothing. Just the eerie quiet of deep space and the sight of a massive planet looming ahead, its surface bathed in the glow of twin suns. He checked the coordinates again. This was the location that had been sent to him, a place he had no reason to trust. And yet, something about it felt familiar. Not in a literal sense. He had never seen this planet before in his life, but in a way that gnawed at the edges of his mind, like a memory buried too deep to reach. The ship's scanners flickered to life, feeding him information about the planet below. Breathable atmosphere. Ruins scattered across the surface. No signs of civilization. It was abandoned. Or at least, that's what it looked like. With no better option, Jake guided the ship into descent, the hull trembling as it sliced through the atmosphere. He had no idea what he was walking into, but if someone, or something, had sent him here, he needed to find out why. The landing was rough, the ship kicking up clouds of golden dust as it settled onto the cracked terrain. The landscape stretched for miles, an endless expanse of jagged rock and towering ruins carved from a material that looked ancient yet strangely untouched by time. Jake stepped out cautiously, his boots crunching against the dry ground. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made his instincts scream that he wasn't alone. He gripped the pulse rifle he had stolen from the armory, keeping it at the ready as he moved toward the nearest structure. The walls of the ruins were covered in intricate carvings, symbols and pictographs that looked eerily similar to his tattoo. His breath hitched. It wasn't a coincidence. This place had something to do with the legend the aliens feared. With the warriors they believed his kind had been. But what did that mean? He reached out, tracing a symbol that looked nearly identical to the one inked on his skin. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground trembled beneath him. A deep, mechanical hum echoed through the ruins as the carvings lit up, glowing with an ethereal blue light. Dust cascaded from the walls, and the air thickened with an energy that made his skin prickle. Something had been activated. A doorway, one that hadn't been visible before, shuddered open. Jake took a step back, pulse hammering in his ears. He had no idea what he had just triggered, but there was only one way to find out. Gun raised, he stepped inside. The interior of the structure was unlike anything he had seen before. Sleek, metallic walls lined with glowing conduits stretched ahead, leading to a massive chamber that pulsed with energy. At its center stood a pedestal, and resting atop it was a device, small, unassuming, but radiating power. As he approached, a hologram flickered to life above the pedestal. The figure that appeared wasn't alien. It wasn't some unrecognizable creature from a forgotten civilization. It was human. Jake froze. The hologram spoke in a language he didn't understand at first, but after a few seconds, his earpiece, still linked to the universal translator, began processing the words. "If you are seeing this, then you have found what was lost." The figure was clad in a suit of armor unlike anything Jake had ever seen, its design both sleek and battle-worn. The man's face was obscured by a helmet, but his stance, his presence, it all radiated authority. "We were not wiped out. We did not disappear. We hid." Jake's mind reeled. This wasn't just a legend. It wasn't just a story the aliens told each other to scare their children. Humanity had been here before. We fought. We conquered. We built an empire that stretched beyond the stars. And when the galaxy united against us, we chose to vanish rather than be destroyed. The hologram's tone darkened. But we were never meant to stay hidden forever. Jake swallowed hard. This changed everything. Earth wasn't just some isolated planet drifting in a vast, uncaring universe. It was the remnant of something greater. A civilization so feared that the rest of the galaxy had conspired to erase its existence. The hologram continued, its message seemingly pre-recorded for a moment just like this. If you are one of us, then the time has come. The galaxy has forgotten what we were. It is time for them to remember. The device on the pedestal pulsed, as if responding to the words. Jake hesitated for only a moment before reaching out. The moment his fingers closed around it, a surge of energy shot through him. His vision blurred, his mind filled with fragmented images, flashes of battles long past, towering warships, cities built on worlds now lost to time. It was overwhelming, like an entire history trying to force itself into his consciousness. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. Jake staggered back, breathing heavily. The device was still in his hand, but now he understood. This wasn't just a relic. It was a key. And he had just unlocked something far bigger than himself. He looked back at the hologram, whose message was nearing its end. You are not alone, it said. And neither is Earth. Jake exhaled slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. For the first time since he had been taken, since he had woken up in a prison cell surrounded by aliens who thought they controlled his fate, he felt like he had the upper hand. He wasn't just going home. He was bringing the truth with him. And the galaxy wasn't ready for what came next.